Okay, we're studying the life of Joseph, and we've been studying him for quite a number of weeks now, and so let's get a context of where we've been so we know where we're going. The structure so far kind of looks like this. It's growing and becoming more and more complex, but we started off with just a brief word about his birth and his childhood. We saw three story arcs, one after another, showing Joseph being raised up for a position of authority and honor in one household, and then something happened, some injustice happened by someone else's sin where it brought him down. The first one was his own household, where his brothers sold him into slavery out of hatred and jealousy. The next one, it was in Potiphar's house, which was an Egyptian captain of the bodyguard, where his wife accused him and put him in a wrong situation. The next one is in the prison house itself. He was raised to a position of authority. And when he helped out those two officials with the dreams, he was left being forgotten. Then the final story arc, which we're in the midst of in our study, and which will continue to the end of the book of Genesis, is the house of Pharaoh. So we see him going through these different houses. And last week we started a sub-story arc within that, which is the visit of the 10 brothers. And we saw last week that in the first visit of the 10 brothers, in the beginning of Genesis 42, we saw Joseph's first dream of the stalks bowing to him of grain was fulfilled. In that context, in Genesis 37, it was 10 stalks all surrounding Joseph, which is exactly what's happening here. The 10 brothers were bowing down before him. And it has to do with grain. They're there to receive and to buy grain, and Joseph is saving them through that. And it ended with the brothers being imprisoned. So we see things being reversed a little bit. So I want to read to you the last portion from last week to get the immediate context. Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies," which we saw that has a connotation of being liars. You are spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined, imprisoned, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Specifically because they were claiming to be honest men. Honest, honorable, righteous men. That's a key theme to this story as we go forward. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Implication, you will die. So they put them all together in prison for 3 days. So now that's where we ended up last week. And it was somewhat of a cliffhanger. Well, what's going to happen? And what's his plan? So this week we're going to continue to look at the life of Joseph and read about the journeys of Joseph's brothers, which is Genesis 42, 18 through 38, which is the end of the chapter. We're going to go through and finish chapter 42. And in this portion of text, we're going to see three scenes concerning the journeys, plural, of Joseph's brothers. The first journey is actually them going back to their father, going back to the land of Canaan. But simultaneously, we're going to see them taking a journey back to their heavenly Father. As this situation, the difficulties, the stress, the trials are bringing them not further away from God, but closer to God. So the first scene records the brothers before Joseph. Chapter 42, verses 18 through 25. And in 18 through 20, we see Joseph's change of plans. Let's read that. So now Joseph said to them on the third day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified and you will not die." So after the 3 days in prison, Joseph has plenty of time to think. He brings these brothers back before him, and he says, "Do this and live." That's a subtle and powerful reminder that Joseph has the power of life and death over them. So he's really instilling that this is a serious situation. And he says, "I fear God, for I fear God." What does that mean? That's an important concept in this text. So what does it mean to fear God? To fear God is to be careful of ever displeasing God, which leads one to obey his word from a heart of love, devotion, and thankfulness above all else. When we fear God, we're feared that we ever disappoint him, ever displease him. It is an affectionate fear. So when Joseph says, I fear God, he's saying that he's a believer in Yahweh. And he has reevaluated his original plans before God. And he doesn't want to be disobedient or do anything that would displease his God. And so, thus, he himself is fearing judgment or discipline from God. He wants to be obedient. He wants to do everything he can to stay in the will of God. So he doesn't want to treat them unjustly. So by adding this phrase, Joseph is also introducing the concept and the idea of faith and obedience of God to determine the brother's relationship with God or lack thereof. If they are faithful to God in their actions and in their decisions, all will go well. Just as it has gone well with Joseph. But they don't know that. He's in control. He knows he has the power, and he's keeping all the information to himself. His brothers don't know that, but he's subtly reminding them and pointing them towards God, who is in control of their situation. And this is a warning not to trust in their own understanding, but to trust in God. It is Joseph's call for wisdom. Joseph's narrative, the whole story, is put into a wisdom idea. He's wiser than all the nation of Egypt. And it goes along with the rest of the scriptures which proclaim about fear and wisdom. Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. But those who fear God, it's the beginning of knowledge. Other passages in Proverbs says the beginning of fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom as well. Ecclesiastes, Solomon's wisdom work, he's concluding and says the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. So when Joseph is saying, I fear God, do this is a new plan, I fear God, this is wisdom. This is something that he's encouraging them to do, which will be wise. So, after 3 days of evaluating and contemplating God's wisdom, Joseph changes his plans. Instead of keeping 9 confined and letting 1 go, Joseph now requires the opposite. He's saying, I'll keep just 1 of you, and 9 of you go. Now, why would he do that? What's the wisdom there? Well, number 1, if he only sends 1 back, there's a limited amount of grain that 1 can take back. Even if he has multiple donkeys, it's only going to have a limited amount of supply that he can bring back. And further, if there's just 1 man going back, he is an easy target for robbers. And in fact, Joseph, if he sent back 1 man, that would be literally putting a bullet sign, target on his back. He would be robbed and even potentially killed. And the rest of the family on the other end in Canaan wouldn't get any of the grain. So it would not only bring harm to the 1, but potentially to the rest of them that are there in Canaan. So number 2, if 9 are returning, it's much safer. They can carry more grain, especially for the rest of the families who might otherwise starve. Notice when he says to carry grain for the famine of your households, meaning each brother, majority of the brothers have wives and children of their own. So he's fully aware that him sending back the 9 is providing for a number of people, much more. And if he sends back the 9, and the 9 are going to return to Egypt with Benjamin is safer with 9 others rather than just with 1. And then third, Joseph is doing this. He's changed his plan to see if they are in fact honest men, if they're righteous, if they're honorable men. Chapter 42, verse 11, The brothers were claiming to be honest men. So here, this is going to be a test to see if they would keep their word. They could easily lie to Jacob about what happened here, about what happened to the one brother, and just leave him behind. They have the grain, they have what they came for. They could easily deceive their father just like they did with Joseph. So here we see a contrast with households and confined. When it says here, let one of your brothers be confined in, literally it says, the house of prison, where the rest of them are to go to your own houses. So there's a contrast here of one is going to the dungeon, to the pit, and one is going back home. Do you remember some other circumstances where one of the brothers went into a pit, into a dungeon, and the rest of them went back home? You see, this is literally, he's giving them a second chance to do the right thing, to make the right decisions, to be faithful. So he's emphasizing in this passage that they have a second chance to be faithful. They weren't back then, but 20 years have passed. And notice, he is making the situation very serious. They've already been in jail for 3 days, and now they're out. So they've experienced, so far in Egypt, has not been pleasant. But notice here, he says, do this and live, and then here, and you will not die. Their obedience to him, they're following Joseph's instructions, is extremely important. Their life depends on it. So the question that some scholars have is, how would Joseph carry out that threat? How would he have control over that? Well, Joseph knows that the famine would last for 7 years. This is year 1. So he knows that those brothers, they're going back home, they're taking as much grain as they can take, but they'll be back. That grain's going to run out. They'll be back, and if they don't come back, they're not going to get grain from anywhere else, and they're going to starve. So we are left to ask, are they honest men? What are they going to do with this new situation, this new test of their faith? Well, the text then records, and they did so. This is just a summary statement by the author that says, yes, they were honest. They were those honorable men. And this reminds me of my wife. When she reads a book, she'll read a couple of chapters or maybe just an introduction, then she'll read the last few pages. She says, well, I want to see if I even want to bother with the end. But then more importantly, she says, I want to see how the author gets there to the end. And so that is actually what our author, which is Moses, is doing. He's telling us, okay, they did so. They were honest men. They were being faithful. So how did they get there? So now we will, as we go through these next few chapters, see how these men became honest men. And we'll see that journey of how they became respectable, honorable, righteous men. So the very next verse, the narrative goes back and gives us important details to fill that in, to begin to fill that in, to begin to show us those steps towards this end. As we read the brothers' quote-unquote private conversation in verses 21 through 22. 21 says, then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore his distress has come upon us. Okay, with the idea of a fear of God being introduced, the brothers make a connection between their sin and what they're going through right now. And here they're saying they are guilty. Truly, we are guilty. They're guilty of some crime, some sin. And the implication of the word in Hebrew of being guilty is that there's a penalty for that. There's a payment that has to be paid because you are guilty. And they're guilty, they know specifically, because of our brother. And they specifically say, because we saw the distress. Distress, the word there connotes that Joseph had a need, he was anxious, and he needed someone to deliver him, and it didn't happen. It's the opposite idea is salvation, is deliverance. And he was in distress because he was innocent. And Joseph, we read here, we didn't read earlier, but we read here that Joseph was pleading with him. verbally pleading with them, desperately begging for their favor and for their compassion. And it says they didn't listen. The word there is shema. It means to hear with the ears and then act accordingly. They heard him, but they didn't care about it. They rejected him. They were guilty of sin. And so now the brothers clearly see the parallel between their unusual and unpleasant situation and Joseph's. When it says, therefore, this distress has come upon us, it reflects their recognition of God's sovereignty in bringing about this justice. That God's justice and his holiness demands that every sin be accounted for. And that, in reality, it's either paid by one of two parties. One by Christ on the cross as a substitute for all of our sins and the guilt of all of our sins and the judgment of all our sins, or by the individual eternally separated from God. Those are the only two options. Now, God's judgment and justice is sometimes brought about in part in life, in history, in reality. But if not, sometimes we see the wicked prosper and they never seem to ever get punished. We know that everyone will have to stand before God, where justice will prevail because God is a God of justice. It has to happen, whether in this life or in the life to come. So in these words of the brothers, what do you see? There's something that's extremely important to this narrative and to the ripped, destroyed relationship between one brother and the other 10. What we see here is confession. They are confessing of their wickedness and the shame of their actions. And that has stayed with them for 20 years. They've been carrying that burden for 20 years. And it's in this difficulty that they are confessing it. They're saying what we did was wrong, and they're guilty. That is the first step in coming to reconciliation. We see the first step of reconciliation occurring right here. And then there's Reuben. Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." Reuben seems to come out of nowhere. He's angry, and he's having ignorant self-righteousness. Truly, do these words help the situation at all? No, it doesn't at all. Reuben is standing not with his brothers, but he's standing against them. He's blaming them. He's causing division. And notice it says, reckoning for his blood. Reuben believes Joseph is dead. And applies what God is doing in this situation is bringing about that judgment for that death. And he has a proper understanding. In Genesis 9:6 it says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he was made." So that's happened earlier in Genesis. And we know at this time there was an oral law that was passed on. God's words were passed orally one to another. So he had these ideas, these words, especially through the Noahic covenant. So he is clearly applying that principle to his own life. We are going to die. In other words, we're going to receive judgment because we killed a man. And notice it says here, now comes the reckoning for his blood. The comes there in Hebrew, it connotes that it's actually seeking out. So it again shows God's sovereign hand seeking out and bringing about justice. Their time has come. And they're going to be reckoned by God for his blood, meaning for the death of Joseph. So apparently, his other brothers never told Reuben that they sold Joseph, because I guess he's the only one that doesn't realize that he's not dead, potentially not dead. So they're speaking privately, and they're speaking honestly among themselves in Hebrew. And the next passage we see Joseph's plan being carried out. So the reason why I'm saying that is because the text then says, they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. So Joseph is again acting very wise. And he put an interpreter between them to maintain the disguise that this is not truly Joseph, but an Egyptian who doesn't know Hebrew. This also, it gave the brothers a false sense of security and privacy so they can communicate freely with one another in Hebrew and speak truthful. So there's a play of words here in Hebrew where in 21 it says, and when the brothers are saying, we would not listen to Joseph. Here Reuben said that you brothers would not listen to me. And here it says Joseph understood. Literally, Joseph listened. It's the same word in Hebrew. So although they didn't listen, Joseph is. So this revelation that they're speaking in Hebrew and Joseph is understanding, the information that Joseph is understanding has shared two things. Number one, it shows they are truly remorseful for what they did. And then number two, it's a revelation that Reuben fails an attempt to save Joseph's life. These revelations impact Joseph emotionally, and he turned away from them and wept. When he turned away, he went out of the room, and he wept, he cried in relief. The emotions were overwhelming him, and they had to come out. The question we need to ask is, why did Joseph weep? What made him weep? He was reliving the wickedness and the rejection committed against him by the brothers, especially seeing them. Remember, Manasseh's name was, God has caused me to forget all my troubles and forget my household. He has already moved on, and here they are, and he has to deal with them. So he's reliving these painful memories, the unresolved issues. They're just eating away at his soul. And in their confessed guilt of wrong and wrongdoing and Reuben's attempt to save him, Joseph observes what his soul actually desires, deeply desires, which is that chance of reconciliation. That's the greatest good. That's the greatest goal. It is sometimes painful because you have to relive those memories, those painful things, the things that harmed you. But Joseph has hope. So this is the first step towards reconciliation on the part of the one who is offended. That Joseph could have just said, forget it. He could have killed him. He could have enacted revenge, or he could have just kept the disguise and just let him go about their way and never reintroduce himself to that painful situation or to that family. But he realizes here that that's his greatest desire. Families should not be rejected. Families should be together. So he's realizing that reconciliation is the greatest end. Continuing on in verse 24, it says, but when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in a sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So he bound Simeon. Simeon's 43 years old at this time. And he did this right before their eyes. It adds another element of that seriousness to the situation, and especially Simeon's future in the dungeon, in the pit. Now, question, why Simeon? Why not Reuben or the rest of them? Reuben's the eldest, and we don't know. Ultimately, the text doesn't say, and we don't know, but it could be that Joseph chose Simeon because Reuben, he made an attempt to save Joseph's life. And there's some Jewish tradition that says that Simeon was the harshest against Joseph 20 years ago. But either way, Simeon is there. And in verse 25, we see that Joseph's not acting out of revenge. He's not being hateful or angry with them, but he's actually being quite generous and gracious to them. He's told them to load them up with grain and to give them the money back. Put them in the sack, and then here's extra provisions for you, which were not required. And it says at the end, and thus it was done for them. Summary statement, it says that Joseph's people, the Egyptians, did exactly what Joseph commanded. So a question I want to ask is, why did he return the money? Well, I think there's two answers. Number one, could he really charge his own family? I think he might have had problems charging his own family, but number two, this adds a layer to the testing. Do you remember that when the brothers put Joseph in the pit, they were tempted by money? Hey, let's make a few shekels, right? So now, is this going to be the same situation? They have another brother in prison, and they're coming back, and oh, by the way, look at all this money that we have. We can just make up a story, tell that story to our dad, and just profit from the money. They don't know the money's in the sack yet, but they sure will, and soon. And so he's putting a possible motivation of money, of greed, again, to see if that is still a controlling factor, or if they fear God, if they are honorable, honest men. So, this question, this test, brings us to the second scene, which is the troubling discovery on the way home, verses 26 and 28. So let's read the first two verses. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. As one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. So they are presumably in the capital, down here in Egypt, and where they are staying is right around Hebron, so in this area here, which is approximately 350 miles away. So they had to take a couple of stops. So here, during one of their stops, they are feeding the donkey from some of that grain. It's interesting, the text just says it's one of them. Jewish tradition says it's Levi, but they open their sack and they find the money. Now it's interesting, in Hebrew the word for money is silver. At this time there was no coins. Coins weren't started being minted until the 6th century BC. And thus during this time different precious metals, gems, spices, incense, and other luxurious items were traded and they were weighed out in bartering. And Egypt lacked silver. It didn't have any silver mines, so it was a very precious commodity. So he's opening his sack, and the author, Moses, is very clever in what he does here, because he uses the word sack here is actually the same word for sackcloth. And you remember what sackcloth is? It's the clothing, the rougher clothing, usually made from camel or goat hair, that one puts on when they're mourning. And there's only one other time in Genesis earlier than this that it happens. That's in chapter 37, when Jacob put on sackcloth because of his understanding and belief that Joseph was dead. So here we see that word being used here. Now, it's used for sacks as well, but the connotation is they're opening this up, and that's bringing mourning. This isn't a good sign. Their situation has just doubled in trouble. Moving on to 28, it says, Then he said to his brothers, My money has been returned, and behold, it is even in my sack. There's a different word for sack there. And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, What is this that God has done to us? Obviously, they are troubled. So their heart sank is literally in Hebrew, their heart went out. It means they lost all of their courage. And they turned each other trembling in fear. Because remember, they were accused as being spies. And they just got out, barely got out from that. And now they can be held to the allegations that they're thieves. Because how did they get their money back? So now their complication, their situation had just gone from bad to worse. So when they say, what is this that God has done to us? They view the growing complexity and certain trouble that's ahead of them as God's judgment. It's interesting because they really don't realize that it's actually God's testing of their faith. Will they obey him? Will they be honest men? Will they go back to Egypt even though that may result in them being imprisoned or even killed unjustly? Will they have enough faith in God to do what is right and trust him for the circumstances? So with that, we come to the third and final scene, which is the brothers before Jacob. And first we see the brothers give their report. Starting in verse 29, When they came to their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no longer alive. The youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan.' The man, the Lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take grain for the famine of your households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land.'" First, notice they don't use Joseph's name. Obviously, they don't know it's Joseph, so they're not using Joseph's name, but they don't use his his Egyptian name either. It's left general. And so it's a little neat detail of the author and of the narrative. And the brothers here in this story, they pretty much recap it faithfully. They give a softened version of the story to their father because they don't want to trouble him. They leave out that they were in prison for 3 days. And the way they make it sound here is that Simeon is staying in Egypt as a guest, but it's a little harsher than that because he's bound and he's in prison. They don't mention the threat of death by Joseph, and they don't speak of the money that was found in the one sack. So this report shows, number one, that they're not motivated by money to abandon Simeon, because they're telling their father what actually happened. They're not lying to their father. Then number two, they're trying to fulfill their end of the bargain, even though they may be accused of theft and espionage, and thus receive such punishment. They're telling their father the plan and what they need to do. So in taking the responsibility and moving forward in faith, they are becoming honest men. So whatever persuasion over their father was gained, it was soon lost. Let's continue. And we see 3 reasons why Jacob refuses to let Benjamin go to Egypt. The first reason is the appearance of theft. 35 says, "It came about as they were emptying their sacks that, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed." So the alleged crime has just increased exponentially. And if they go back, they're heading into certain doom, certain imprisonment. This contrast in this section together, the words are being contrasted when it says, "We are honest men, we are honest men." And oh, by the way, the money is here. What does that look like? That they're not honest men. And thus, they all see it. They all tremble. The word dismay there is literally, they feared. They all had great fear. And even their father does, because their father realizes, this doesn't look good at all. You've just proclaimed that you were honest men to the ruler of Egypt, and now, how did this happen? So, again, the money was found in every man's sack, conveying the idea that each of them now has reason to mourn. The idea that, and they were fearful, they were afraid. It can be a play on words here, because there's no object. What did they fear? We gain it from the context, right? That they're afraid of being accused and being punished. But I think there possibly is an ambiguity there in the text that allows for us to say that they, because of this difficulty, they didn't run further away from God and trust in themselves, but they actually started to fear God and obey Him. Moving on to verse 36, their father Jacob said to them, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin, all of these things are against me. So what Jacob is saying in an overly emotional way is he's saying that they have brought bad news about the loss of Joseph, which caused them great mourning and sorrow. Now, they're bringing him news that Simeon is gone, and practically just like he's dead, because he's not going to see him anymore. He's left there, and Jacob is just assuming the worst. And now they want to take away Benjamin, also, who is the favored one. So Jacob's words here, they ring truer than he would have suspected. His words here may also have a little bit of symbolic layering of meaning because of the names in Hebrew. A Hebrew reader, a Hebrew audience can hear literally that God has added to me no more. And God has heard me no more. And now you will take the son of my right hand, my honor, the place of honor. Do you see, then he says, all these things are against me. I think there's a play on words there when their names, just adding another layer of, look what's happening. I am being judged. Everything, all of these things, these circumstances, they're against me. I'm being crushed. So to try to uplift and bring the fears down of their father, because all the sons know they need to go back to Egypt. They need to fulfill what they said they would do and save Simeon. Reuben's weightless pledge in verse 37. It says, then Reuben spoke to his father saying, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. So Reuben says he has 2 sons. This is the first time we've ever heard of this. Obviously, he's married, and he has at least 2 sons. We know from later texts that he actually has 4 sons. So possibly these are the 2 oldest sons. He has Hanok and Palu, and then he also has Hezron and Carmi. And it's interesting in the text when the genealogies, the first 2 are grouped together, and the second 2 are grouped together. So it's a possibility that there's a gap in between them. So anyway, he's offering his 2 sons, just trying to show the seriousness that I am willing to lose 2 of my sons. I pledge to you, I will do this. This will be the greatest priority. Put them in my care, literally put them in my hand, in my control. So Reuben meant in his words to ensure confidence in his own resolve to return Benjamin to his father. But Reuben is showing that he fears God, that he's willing to, in spite of the possible danger, he's willing to go there and to do this task, to free Simeon. He's willing to trust in God. So we need to remember our previous stories that Reuben, number 1, is the oldest, so he's responsible, right? And he was responsible when Joseph went up. How did he do there? Not well. And then he's also responsible when the 10 brothers went down. How did that go? Well, now Simeon is there. So his track record isn't the best. So this doesn't bring much confidence or much weight to his father. And this brings us to a final verse in verse 38, which communicates Jacob's fears. Where it says, but Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. When he says, my son shall not go down with you, that is a strong prohibition in Hebrew. It is an emotional statement of this is not happening, end of discussion. And then he says, for he alone is left. This obviously shows he has favoritism to the sons of Rachel, of Joseph, who he believes is dead, and now Benjamin is the only link, the only connection he has to his love of Rachel. And so there's obvious favoritism there. And we see in these words that if harm should come to him in the journey, that you'll bring me down to to Sheol in sorrow, we see his great love for Benjamin. And we need to understand Jacob's struggle here, his emotional struggle. Because if you remember, Jacob was the one who had Joseph at home while the other brothers were out in the fields. And he sent Joseph by himself, presumably, all the way up 50 miles to Shechem. And then he went further to visit the brothers and visit the herds and see how everyone was doing. And so you can guarantee that for the last 20 years, Jacob has been telling himself, if only I had not sent up Joseph, he would be alive. He would be blaming himself. So now they're asking him to send Benjamin. And he's just assured that Benjamin, if he sends him, will be to his doom. The word for harm there, it communicates a fatal injury or fatal harm. So Jacob is just clearly afraid of losing Benjamin. And his response to fear is to take control of the situation, to try to avoid further harm. This is a common response when we're afraid, to try to take as much control as possible so we can guarantee the outcome. But can you? Can he guarantee the outcome? No. Jacob is not in control of the circumstances. He needs to trust in God. In reality, little does he know, but in reality, would Benjamin be safer in Canaan without grain or in Egypt? He'd actually be safer in Egypt. And God is orchestrating these events and, in essence, testing Jacob as well. Will Jacob live in light of his fear of his past, or will he continue to trust in God? So at the end there, where he says, if harm happens to him, and you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. What he's saying here is if Benjamin is harmed, Jacob would no longer find joy in life, no longer find happiness in life. From here on out, he will be sad until death. There'll be no reason for him to live. Those words that you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow are repeated from chapter 37, where he said those words in reference to his understanding that Joseph was dead. So the brothers again find themselves in a similar situation. And we are left asking, well, if Benjamin is the favored son, just like Joseph was the favored son, is Benjamin in trouble? Is he in danger? Do the brothers hate him as well? Are they jealous of him? The brothers seem to be going through that situation again as a second test. They obviously failed before, but have they changed? Where are they on that journey? So this is the end, and we are left with many unresolved issues. The plot just keeps thickening and getting more complex and more questions. We are left asking, will Jacob change his mind and allow Benjamin to go to Egypt? Will the brothers be viewed as honest men and return to Egypt? Will the brothers act out of jealousy and hatred towards Benjamin? Will Simeon ever be rescued from prison? Will Joseph reveal himself to his family? Will Joseph be reconciled with his brothers? Will Joseph's second dream be fulfilled? We're left with a ton of questions that haven't been answered. And that comes the end of chapter 42. The journeys of Joseph's brothers. And as we continue on chapter 43 and following, we're going to see them still continue to grow and continue to show their faith. So let's move to applications of the text that we covered today. Number one, to fear God is to be careful not to displease him. Righteous fear leads one to obey God's words from a heart of love, of devotion, of thankfulness above all else. Joseph subtly reminds his brothers to fear God and to obey him in all circumstances and not to trust in their own understanding. Is your life characterized by this kind of fear? Are you conscious of serving and pleasing your God? Number two, Joseph and his brothers model the first steps in a pattern of reconciliation. The brothers confess their guilt, which is required of the responsible party, and Joseph desires to be reconciled. He is willing to go forward, which is also required for those who have been offended or hurt. Number three, And we'll continue that pattern as we see it in the text. Those are the first steps. Number 3, the brothers interpret their current situation as God's just judgment for their sin, unaware that God is actually leading them in mercy, provision, and healing. God is not excusing their sin, but he's gracious to those who desire to live honest, righteous, honorable lives before him. For these, God has provided a suitable sacrifice for the guilt of their sin, which they don't know about yet, but we know about looking back because of the cross. Number 4, throughout the narrative, their brothers were given second chances to show themselves faithful in areas where they have previously failed. We see them acting in faith even when tempted by monetary gain and the threat of facing unjust punishment. We are all works in progress, learning from the mistakes of the past, striving to be obedient in the present, and dependent on his grace for the future. And then number 5, Jacob was afraid to lose Benjamin and tried to control the circumstances around him. By doing so, he was inadvertently putting Benjamin in greater risk. We must do what is right, realize that we cannot control the events of the world, and trust God for the outcome of our circumstances.